currently in use in the United States. Pfizer, Moderna, and Johnson & Johnson use these two strategies for developing the vaccine. So first, we've got the mRNA vaccines. What is mRNA? If you're not a biology student, you may not be as familiar with this term as those who are, but you probably have heard that DNA is our genetic code. It has the instructions to make all of the proteins that give us our heritable traits. But DNA doesn't turn into protein on its own. There's an intermediate step. DNA is used as a template to produce what's called messenger or mRNA. And mRNA is then what is used as a template directly to make proteins. An analogy for this that I read today, which I thought is useful, is imagine that our cells are libraries, and imagine that the nucleus of our cell is a library, and the DNA is the books inside the library. But imagine this is some crazy type of library where you can't check out books. Everything's like in the reference stacks. You can't check out a book. So you can't take the DNA out of the nucleus and make that into the proteins that form it. So you can copy.
Just make sure you eat enough food.
Can you guys all mute yourselves if you're not muted, please? I keep getting distracted by sounds in the background. So you can use the copier machine in the library to copy the pages of the book, and those pages can leave the library. So those copies of the pages that can leave the library are your messenger RNA. It's not a perfect analogy, but maybe it gives you a clearer picture of what messenger RNAs are. So mRNA vaccines that Pfizer and Moderna have developed, the vaccine is the mRNA or the instructions for making the SARS-CoV-2 spike protein. And so that mRNA is delivered to our cells. In our cells, that messenger RNA is used to actually produce the spike protein. Right? We're not producing the whole virus inside our cells. We're just making one little piece of the virus. And it's that piece of the virus that is the target of a protective immune response. So our immune cells will see that spike protein that's been produced. We'll get T cells and antibodies produced against the spike protein. And we've done all of this without actually giving us COVID-19. But if we're ever exposed to SARS-CoV-2, we'll have a memory of it, antibodies ready to attack the virus and prevent disease. Now, there have been some claims that these mRNA vaccines can alter our DNA. And frankly, I don't know where these claims quite originated from, but this is one of those claims that just is entirely false. So the mRNA in the vaccine never enters the nucleus. That's where our DNA is. So the mRNA doesn't go to the nucleus. It cannot interact with our DNA, let alone alter our DNA. So the Pfizer vaccine, the Moderna vaccines, they don't delete DNA, they don't add anything to our DNA, they don't mutate our DNA. None of this is biologically possible. So then I want to move on to the other type of vaccine, and this is the viral vector vaccines. Johnson & Johnson developed a viral vector vaccine. In this strategy, you're taking a different virus and you're modifying that different virus and using it as a system to deliver, in the case of COVID-19 vaccines, to deliver the instructions again for that SARS-CoV-2 spike protein to our cells. So Johnson & Johnson used an irrelevant or different human virus called adenovirus serotype 26. They removed the parts of that virus that allow that virus to replicate, and they stuck in the gene for the SARS-CoV-2 spike protein. Right? So then our cells will get infected with this adenovirus vector. The virus vector can get into our cells, deliver that SARS-CoV-2 spike gene, which gets made into spike protein. And then after that, everything is basically the same as the other vaccines. We recognize that spike protein is foreign and we develop an immune response against the spike protein. So if we are ever exposed to the whole virus, we'll be protected. Okay, so some of the scary things maybe that you've heard about this is that, well, we're being infected with a different virus. We're just using this adenovirus as a delivery system for the SARS-CoV-2 spike gene. That adenovirus in our cells doesn't replicate. It's not a virus that causes severe disease anyway, but it doesn't replicate. The vector DNA does not integrate into our own DNA. So there is no concern of that DNA inserting itself into ours and causing deletions or mutations that could cause health problems. Right? That doesn't happen with these viruses. An Ebola virus vaccine was authorized for use by the World Health Organization several years ago using this same strategy. And now we know the Johnson & Johnson COVID-19 vaccine has been given emergency use authorization in the United States. All right, so those are the two big strategies for vaccine development that Moderna, Pfizer, and Johnson & Johnson have used. How are these vaccines tested? And how do people learn that they're safe and that they're effective? So clinical trials occur in 3 phases before a product can be authorized or approved by the FDA. I'm going to talk really just about phase 3 testing, but just know that Moderna, Pfizer, Johnson & Johnson, they went through all 3 phases. They did a phase 1, they did a phase 2. Those data were presented to the FDA, they've been reviewed, but I'm just focusing on the phase 3 data. The goal of clinical trials is to establish that a vaccine is safe and that a vaccine is effective, that it prevents the disease that you're trying to prevent. So here in this little graphic, phase 3 trials, during a phase 3 trial, tens of thousands of people are recruited to participate voluntarily in the trial. The COVID-19 vaccines recruited between 30 and 60,000 patients for each of the phase 3 trials. Those 30 to 60,000 patients are divided into 2 groups, roughly 1-to-1 ratio. One group will receive the vaccine. They don't know they're getting the actual vaccine, and neither does the nurse or the physician who's actually administering the vaccine. But one half of the group gets the vaccine. The other half is the control group. They get a placebo. So in the case of, say, the Pfizer vaccine, they're getting a shot that has everything that the actual vaccine has. It just doesn't have that messenger RNA that codes the spike protein. And then you just send the people out into the world to live their lives, and you just watch over the course of a month or 2 or 3, in which of these groups do we see more people getting infected with SARS-CoV-2 and getting COVID-19? For the vaccine to be effective, what you want to see, or to demonstrate that the vaccine is effective, what you want to see is that more people in the control group get infected than in the vaccinated group. Okay? Not because we want to see people getting infected with SARS-CoV-2, but in order to demonstrate vaccine efficacy, what you need to demonstrate is that people who don't get your vaccine get SARS-CoV-2 at a higher rate than people who get your vaccine. And then once the data are collected, these companies go to the FDA, they present the data, and apply for authorization or approval of the product. Even after a vaccine is licensed or authorized for emergency use, safety and efficacy are continuously monitored. Here are 2 mechanisms by which you can report any adverse events or severe side effects that you might experience with the vaccine. There's the vSafe. This is a smartphone tool. If you've gotten at least 1 dose of any of these vaccines, you may have been given information about the smartphone-based vSafe tool, so that you can self-report side effects that you're experiencing due to vaccine. This is a federal program here through the CDC, the Vaccine Adverse Event, I forget what the R stands for, system. It's a reporting system. It's another system of reporting adverse events associated with vaccines. And the data for these are accessible to the public for free. There have been some questions specifically from some of you about the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. And so I want to I want to set the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines aside just for a moment and focus on some of the phase 3 data from the Johnson & Johnson trials. This is a link to the full data that Johnson & Johnson presented to the FDA when they sought emergency use authorization, which we know has been given. So if you're interested in looking at this data, it's all here, it's all free, you can access it. The headline when Johnson & Johnson got their emergency use authorization was that the vaccine is 66% effective at preventing COVID-19. This was the headline that was grabbed by the media, and it's been, so our minds have obviously gone to 95% for Moderna and Pfizer, 66% for Johnson & Johnson. Well, I want the Moderna and Pfizer vaccine. Can I wait it out and opt for the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines over the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, which appears to be less effective? I would argue that the media reporting on this hasn't been entirely accurate. And I want to dig a little bit deeper into Johnson & Johnson's data to try to convince you that the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is as effective in many cases, in the most important ways, as the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines. I have no professional or financial interest in any of these vaccines, right? So I'm not advocating for one over the other, and I think I'll make that clear here in a couple of slides. So that 66% number was the primary endpoint that Johnson & Johnson was reporting, and that is it prevents moderate to severe COVID-19. There's a specific definition of moderate to severe COVID-19, and you can download these data if you want to know what it means. In the US specifically, it was 72% effective at preventing moderate to severe COVID-19. One of the advantages to the Johnson & Johnson trial is that it was an international trial. It took place in South Africa, it took place in the United States, it took place in, I believe, Brazil, or another South American country. They also measured and reported some secondary endpoints. If we're looking just at severe or critical, all right, so take the moderate away. And now how effective is it at preventing severe COVID-19? Now the efficacy bumps up to 85%. Sounds better, right? Not that 66% is bad. 85% is better. Another secondary endpoint is how well did it prevent hospitalization? By 28 days post-vaccination, it was 100% effective against hospitalization. 100%. It doesn't get better than 100%. It was also 100% protective against death. Nobody in the clinical trials who got the Johnson & Johnson vaccine died, including not just the United States, but that includes South Africa, where the dominant virus that is circulating is that South African variant, for which there's been some concern that vaccines may not be effective. Well, clearly, these vaccines are quite effective still, even against the South African variant, which is important. 74% protection against becoming infected asymptomatically. That's a huge number in terms of stopping transmission and halting this pandemic. If you can be about 74% sure that if you have this vaccine, you won't become infected. These are data that Pfizer and Moderna have not compiled yet. So Johnson & Johnson have released these data and reported them. This is an effective vaccine. So with the question of which vaccine should you take the first vaccine that's available to you as soon as it is available to you. I don't know that we'll ever get to a point where you get to choose. Right? There's all sorts of logistics and insurance issues involved with which vaccine will be available to whom. We have 3 safe and 3 very effective vaccines. Imagine that you're a general manager for an NBA team and you see these 3 guys available in the draft in the same year. Are you taking Kobe Bryant, LeBron James, or Michael Jordan? Can you go wrong with taking LeBron James or Kobe Bryant or Michael Jordan? Whoever you choose, you're getting a game changer. So whichever vaccine you've got, we've got 3 pandemic-changing vaccines available to us. Take the one that you can get. Another concern and question that a lot of people had, and this is not an illegitimate question, this is a good question. People think the vaccines have been rushed, so we can't be certain of their safety. I want to ease your mind that this idea that we can use mRNAs to create vaccines didn't drop out of the sky sometime in spring, summer of 2020. The concept of using mRNAs therapeutically has been in development since at least 1989. Here's a title and an author line from a paper published in 1989, looking at transfecting RNAs into cells. Here's a 1990 paper from some of the same authors, direct gene transfer. They use both DNA and RNA into mouse muscle. In the 30 years since these papers were published, the technologies have been further honed and refined and developed, so that as of 2018, at least 19 institutions have developed mRNA vaccines against 38 different cancer-related targets. Right? So these are potential cancer vaccines as well. And all 38 of those vaccine candidates are at some point of clinical trials. So there is a broad and robust safety profile. A lot of animal studies have been done as well. Safety profile related to using mRNAs therapeutically. All right, so the technology has not been rushed. This is the review article that goes through some of these candidate cancer vaccines that are being developed. You know, in the interest of time, I think I'm going to sort of breeze through this slide, but this is directly from the data that Johnson & Johnson presented to the FDA, looking at adverse events related to their vaccine. If some of you have received your vaccine, you may have experienced some of these, although I don't know that anybody here has received the Johnson & Johnson vaccine yet. Fatigue, headache, muscle aches, nausea, fever, chills. These are some of the more common adverse events associated with the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines. You know, anywhere from 20 to 50% of people or more are experiencing some of these symptoms. They last for a day or two. What is it a sign of? What does it indicate? It indicates that your immune system is getting kicked into gear, right? You don't have COVID-19, you haven't been infected. Your immune system is working and it's doing what it should be doing in order to create a protective immune response. Something that made the news early on and may be a legitimate concern for some of you. The Pfizer and Moderna mRNA vaccines can elicit an anaphylactic response. And so the CDC appropriately has made the recommendation, if you have a history of severe allergic reaction or anaphylaxis, right? Chest tightening, wheezing, difficulty breathing, this kind of an allergic response. Maybe these mRNA vaccines aren't for you, right? So you should always, if you have a question, I'm not a physician, I can't really give you medical advice that you should stand on. If you have a question about the suitability of these vaccines for you, you should consult with your physician before you make an appointment. I would encourage you to do that. But some of the data have been released. Always follow the data, always look for the data. What we're seeing both with the Pfizer and the Moderna shots, less than 5 cases per million. So out of every 1 million doses of these mRNA vaccines administered, 5 or fewer people will experience an anaphylactic response. Okay, we'd love it to be 0, but 5 is actually lower than it was originally predicted to be. So in terms of anaphylaxis, these vaccines are safer than they were originally thought to be. Importantly, all vaccine-associated cases of anaphylaxis, right, people who responded this way, have fully recovered. Right, so nobody has been killed because of these vaccines and anaphylactic reactions. Some other confusion has been generated over this emergency use authorization. What does that mean? How is it different than the FDA fully approving or licensing the product? So I want to just describe that briefly. Emergency use authorization, and this is text straight off the FDA's website, facilitates the availability and use of medical countermeasures during public health emergencies. Right. EUAs do not mean that the product was not robustly tested both for safety and efficacy. Clinical trials are still required, and the companies applying for an EUA must demonstrate both safety and efficacy through robust clinical trials, and they've done that. An EUA can be revoked if continued safety data warrant such a decision. Right? Millions and millions of doses of these vaccines have now been given. Safety data are being collected. And if the data warrant a revocation, is that a word? Revoking an EUA, the FDA has the authority to do that if they see fit. That hasn't been done. So what's the difference then between an emergency use authorization and a full licensing by the FDA? The difference is not in the size of the clinical trials. For vaccine trials, 30 to 40,000 people for a phase 3 trial is typical. And so even if Moderna and Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson had gone first for full licensing and not for EUA, the size of the trial would have been the same. It's not like they were testing their product in fewer people because they were going for EUA. The difference does not lie in the extent of safety follow-up. So the FDA requires 2 months of safety follow-up in everybody in the phase 3 trial. And that's the same whether you're going for EUA or a full license. Right, so the safety follow-up is not, you're not skimping in the safety follow-up for EUA. The difference is in the length of follow-up for efficacy. If you go to the FDA and request full licensing and approval for a vaccine for which you have 3 months of efficacy follow-up, which is what these companies have now, that wouldn't fly. The FDA requires more extensive follow-up for efficacy. Right? So with the efficacy data that are on the table, the FDA approved emergency use authorization. Why was that able to happen so quickly? How did these companies get a robust, even 3 months efficacy data for these vaccines? Part of it is because we're in the middle of a pandemic. This virus is being transmitted widely. And so it didn't take long for people in the vaccine trials, most of them, almost all of them, in the placebo group to contract COVID-19 in the community, right? And those data were able to be collected quickly. One or two other questions, and then I'll stop it. And if we've got time, I'll take maybe 1 or 2 questions that have come in during my talk. I was asked by somebody, if I have epilepsy, can I receive the vaccine? Again, I want to say I'm not a physician. If you have this question, or concerned about the suitability of the vaccine for yourself, consult with your physician, right? But the information that is available on the CDC's website says that there is no evidence that people with epilepsy are at higher risk for severe side effects after vaccination, right? So epilepsy does not automatically disqualify you from receiving the vaccine. But again, consult with your physician to talk about your specific situation if you have a concern. Going forward, more vaccines are going to be approved. You may hear more claims that seem a little bit dubious that you want to check out. So I want to leave some of these resources for you. The CDC website, you could almost get lost on the CDC's website looking at COVID-19 information, but there's a link to the vaccine information. Johns Hopkins University throughout this pandemic has had the Coronavirus Resource Center that allows you to track case rates, mortality rates, and testing globally and nationally. If you want to keep your research closer to home, Butte County, every county public health office is going to have a similar website. And the state of California has a website to track cases, mortality, and vaccine progress. And then I can't talk to anybody without putting in a pitch for TWIV. TWIV is a podcast, This Week in Virology. Here's a link to it. This is a general virology podcast they drop a new episode every week or so, sometimes more than once a week, keeping people informed about the latest research on viruses. I love it and listen to it all the time. But if you go back, pretty much every episode since February of 2020, and we're probably 75, 100 episodes since then, has focused on the pandemic and SARS-CoV-2. If you've got the search function on the archive isn't great, but if you've got a question about anything related to the pandemic or this virus, the answers are there for you, and it's a great resource. Okay, so that's all I've prepared, and I don't want to take too much time away from Omicron, but Cole, if you want to.
Of course, do not worry about us in particular. Today's event is more than just Omicron. So feel free to answer a good amount of questions. No worries.
Okay, so what I'm going to do, I don't know if questions came through in the chat. I'm going to try to back up through the chat then and see when questions have started coming through. And maybe I'll just take them in order. Let's start with this one. We've got a question here. Viviana asks, how can we explain in more layman's terms that the vaccine has not been rushed and it's safe to get? Boy, off the top of my head, that's a tough one. If I had a second to think about it, I would come up with a great answer. How to say that the vaccines haven't been rushed? I mean, really, what I say to people who ask the question is the technologies that are being utilized to deploy these vaccines and develop these vaccines have been under development for decades, literally for decades. In case of the mRNA vaccines, you can trace the genealogy of it back 30 years at least. For the viral vector vaccines, probably even longer. There are vectored vaccines that are used that aren't for COVID-19. So there have been viral vector vaccines approved before. So the science is there to show that the general strategy is safe. So the technologies have been developed over the course of decades, refined and honed for decades. The public is just hearing about some of these technologies now, but this has been going on for a long, long time. For these vaccines specifically, the timeline has been compressed a bit. And so the reason that the timeline could be compressed a bit, really one of the biggest reasons is the federal government fronted the cost of these phase 3 trials. So Pfizer, Moderna, Johnson & Johnson could move ahead with phase 3 trials after they saw that the phase 1 and phase 2 results were positive. They could move ahead with phase 3 trials, knowing that there was no risk, no financial risk for them. The government was willing to eat the cost of those trials if the vaccines ultimately had failed. The federal government was going to eat the cost of those vaccines. So it prompted the companies to get into this. So we've got vaccines from 3 different companies, but the effort has been overwhelming and it's been greater than anything we've seen in the past. So over 100 companies and even more institutions than that have been developing vaccines. Right? So we're talking about these 3, but there are more that will come down the pipeline. Many of them won't be successful. Others will be, but the effort has been an unprecedented effort. It was an all-out war on this virus, and that makes sense because it's a global pandemic. This wasn't just an American problem or a Chinese problem or a European problem. This was a global problem, and so the effort was global. Let's see. Liz, also Viviana, Liz typed an answer into your question there, which is great. Oh, Christine, thank you for this question. This is one that I thought about incorporating into the talk, but figured it would come up. I've heard that it's unknown whether or not this vaccine can affect a woman's ability to conceive / have a healthy child. Is this true? It's not true. So let me put it this way. So again, so what the vaccine is doing is it's exposing our body to the spike protein of the virus. Well, guess what? Another way to be exposed to the spike protein of the virus is to get infected, right? If exposure to the spike protein of SARS-CoV-2 and the immune response that ensues was in any way detrimental to the ability of a woman to conceive or maintain a pregnancy and have a healthy child, then we would have been seeing all along women who get infected naturally with SARS-CoV-2 would have a higher rate of miscarriage, spontaneous abortion, and infertility. But the fact is we have not seen a higher rate. People have not seen a higher rate of those conditions in women who get infected, pregnant women, or women who are trying to get pregnant who are infected with SARS-CoV-2. The Johnson & Johnson data that they presented to the FDA addressed this point specifically. The rate of infertility, miscarriage, and spontaneous abortion in women who received the vaccine in trial is not higher than the rate in women who were in the placebo group. And it's not higher than the general rate of infertility or spontaneous abortion in the public. Right. So the evidence does not support any role for the vaccine in affecting a woman's ability to conceive a child. Right, great question. What if the body is not able to create antibodies? Benham, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, Benham. That's a great question. This is a thing, right? So not everybody who gets vaccinated will be protected. A 95% efficacy rate is about as good as you can hope for, or maybe you could hope for 100%, but no vaccines are 100% effective. 95% effective rate means 5% of the people who got the vaccine experienced disease. Doesn't mean they died, but they got sick. So host genetics certainly comes into play when you're talking about how you respond to a vaccine. And so there's no way to know. I've received my vaccine, both doses of the Moderna vaccine, but there's no way for me to know that if I were exposed to SARS-CoV-2 tomorrow, that I wouldn't get infected and I wouldn't get sick. And so this is part of the reason why, until the vaccine has been more widely distributed and more of us are vaccinated, the CDC is recommending that even if you've been vaccinated, you should continue to wear a mask if you're in public and if you're around a lot of people who haven't yet been vaccinated. It's a great question. But one thing that I can say, at least in terms of the influenza vaccines that are administered each year, even if the vaccine isn't a great match for the strains of influenza virus that circulate in a given season, even if there's not perfect protection, a vaccine still protects you from experiencing severe disease. So you wouldn't experience disease as severe as you would if you had not been vaccinated at all. And I also want to say, Benham, in answer to your question, we often get hung up on antibodies. And antibodies are important, but antibodies aren't the only measure of protection. Right? So, and even in looking at antibodies, when people look at antibodies and say, here's what your antibody response looks like to this vaccine, their antibodies have multiple functions. And when we look at antibody functions as in relation to how well a vaccine works, we're often just looking at one of those functions. There are other functions that we're not measuring. And so even if it looks by these measures that we don't have a strong antibody response, we're only looking at one way that antibodies function, and we're not looking at the other ways that they still may be functioning. We're just not looking. There are also T cells that are important, and we're not always looking at T cells either. So just because you don't see antibodies, though antibodies are a good indicator of vaccine efficacy, they're not the only indicator of vaccine efficacy. If someone has already had COVID, do you recommend they still get the vaccine? That's Gina's question. The CDC's recommendation, and so my recommendation will reflect theirs. If you have had COVID-19, I believe the recommendation is wait 90 days before getting the vaccine. So the recommendation is still to get fully immunized. So if you're going with the Moderna or Pfizer vaccines, even if you've been infected and recovered and you've waited 3 months, the recommendation is still to get both doses of the Pfizer or Moderna vaccines, not just to get one. Ilana's question, how do you feel about a 17-year-old getting the Pfizer vaccine? I believe the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines are recommended for 16 and up or older than 16. I think the Johnson & Johnson one is 18 and up. So if the FDA has authorized the Pfizer vaccine in 17-year-olds, then I would go with the FDA. I would accept their recommendation, I suppose, assuming that you don't have any condition that would put you at high risk for severe side effects. Oh, Liz, you're answering my question. Thank you, Liz. If you are born in another, I'm going to answer this one without having read it yet. If you are born in another country and see a physician at that country, can you still see a physician here to discuss about your condition to see whether or not you can get a vaccine? Absolutely. Yeah, if you've spoken to a physician in a different country, absolutely talk to one here. If you've talked to one physician in the United States and you don't feel like they answered your question adequately, then talk to a second physician in the United States, right? Talk to as many people as you need to talk to get your questions answered, and until you feel safe getting the vaccine. How likely is transmission after getting the vaccine? We don't know, really, is the answer, Emily. There aren't great data on this yet, though those data are coming. Now, for the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, we know that the vaccine is 74% effective at preventing asymptomatic transmission, right? But that means some people are getting vaccinated and are getting infected asymptomatically. So some people are still able to get infected even after they're vaccinated, and that's why we're being recommended to continue masking even after we've been vaccinated, at least for a little while. There is a preliminary report, a paper published, not yet peer-reviewed, right? So there's that caveat. But there are data out there suggesting that if you're vaccinated and you get infected, there's less virus in your upper airways, in your nasal passages. Right? So that might mean that the risk of transmitting the virus is lower, but we also don't really know yet how much virus you need to be shedding from your nose in order to infect somebody else. So even if there is a decrease in the amount of virus in the nasal passages of an immunized individual, it could still be enough to transmit virus. All right, so we don't have a full answer to that question yet. And because we don't yet know, that's why the CDC is recommending that even if you're vaccinated, continue to mask up, especially if you're around people who have not been vaccinated. I'm just going to breeze through here till I see a question mark, and then I'll read that. Kelly, when getting the vaccine, they asked if I had received another vaccine in the last 14 days. Is that to ensure my immune response has the strongest chance to make antibodies? That's a great immunology question. And I'm not sure, without thinking about it for a bit, if I have the answer to that. I suppose it could be because if you've gotten a vaccine in the last week or two, you've already got an immune response going, and so that you may not get the oomph from the immune response seeing the SARS-CoV-2 spike protein. Right? So your immune system might be busy over here dealing with whatever else you've been given in a vaccine, and it might miss the SARS-CoV-2 spike protein. That's my quick, off the top of my head answer. And that's also a strong candidate for, 5 hours from now, thinking back over everything I said. That'll be one of the things I'll be like, oh, I should have said that differently. Yeah, but that's what I'm thinking, Kelly. Do you think they'll require the vaccine to go back to public school full time? So that's a decision that I've really got no say in. So I know in Butte County, Chico Unified Schools, if we're talking K-12, and even at the CSU university level, they've been following the CDC's recommendations on when to go back to full in-person school. The CDC can't mandate anything, it doesn't have the ability to do that. But the CDC does set up guidelines and make recommendations. School districts governing, cities, counties, states can adopt those guidelines and follow those recommendations or not. In California, in Butte County, Chico Unified School Districts, the California State University, they've been following the CDC's guidelines and recommendations. The CDC's guidelines do not require vaccines. Well, if we're talking about teachers, right, K-12, they don't require vaccines as part of those guidelines. Right? Doesn't mean that universities and school districts can't be more strict than the CDC, but that's not required. The California State University is not mandating this, and maybe this is actually what you were asking, finally getting around to answering it. The CSU is not requiring students to receive their vaccine to return to classes. Right? That's a decision that would come from the Chancellor's office in Long Beach. And last I heard, the Chancellor has not made that mandate, though I believe the recommendation is that students be vaccinated if they have, when they have their opportunity. And part of the reason we're holding this event this evening is to give you a chance to ask these questions and to get the information that you need so that you can be comfortable with the decision you make. What is the point of getting the vaccine if you don't know how long immunity lasts, especially if you've already had the virus? Well, if you've already had the virus, the same thing holds true. We don't know how long immunity lasts from natural infection. So if you were infected last June and immunity lasts for 6 months, we don't know that it does, but if it lasts just 6 months, then you're no longer protected in March of 2021. So we know that the vaccines are probably effective or are effective for at least 3 months because that's the efficacy follow-up data that Johnson & Johnson and Moderna and Pfizer had when they went to the FDA. In reality, the protection is probably longer than that. But is it 9 months, 12 months, 2 years? That we don't know. And so how long protection lasts, we don't know. And whether, so we also don't know then a year from now or 2 years from now, will we need to go get a booster shot? We don't know that yet. So what's the point of getting vaccinated, even if we don't know that? Well, we know there's protection, right? We know that if you get vaccinated, at least for 3 months, you're not going to get severely ill, you're not going to get hospitalized, and you're not going to die. And in the case of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, we know that it halts transmission. And that's the way to end this pandemic and to save lives. Raylani, I'm not skipping your question about blood donations. I don't know the answer. Are blood donations helpful after having COVID? Yeah, I'm not entirely sure the answer to that question. Oh, Kelly wants me to come back to a question that was skipped. I feel like early on in the development of COVID vaccines, the focus was on targeting the mucosal immune system, like a nasal spray or a pill. Why has this changed to more of a traditional intramuscular approach? I don't know who originally asked the question, but I'm not familiar with any efforts to develop a nasal spray or pill. From what I understand, all of the early vaccine efforts were focused on just what we're seeing now, shots in the arm, or different strategies, like mRNA vaccines, vector vaccines, and some other strategies coming down the line, but they all, as far as I know, involve shot. Now there are influenza vaccines that you can take intranasally, the nasal spray, flu mist. And so maybe people are working on those, and those will eventually be developed for COVID-19. If you would prefer that to the needle, but I don't know that the focus has changed during the course of the pandemic. How are we doing, Cole?
Good. If you just want to finish up the last one or two questions.
I see that's the last one in chat. From Marcus, do we know exactly how the virus started? And if a similar virus were to come up in the future, would we be able to recover from it quicker than what we did in the past year? That's a great question. We could talk all night about the answer to that question. to answer your specific question, we don't know exactly, that's the key word, we don't know exactly how this virus started, but we know a lot about where it came from. It emerged in bats. That's not unusual. Bats carry Ebola virus without disease. They carry all sorts of coronaviruses without disease. Other viruses that you've never heard of, they're in bats without disease, but they can cause severe disease in humans. Every coronavirus that can infect a human, and there are 6 or 7 of them, 4 of them cause the common cold. And then there's this one that we're talking about. There's another SARS virus that's related to this one, and then there's another one from the Middle East. They all come from bats. They've all come from bats at some point in history. So this is not unprecedented, it's not unusual, and in fact, it wasn't unpredicted. You can go back, so SARS-1, right, so we're calling this SARS-2, that means there was a SARS-1. Before there was a SARS-2, it was just SARS, but now it's SARS-1. That emerged in China in 2002, 2003. And it did not spread as widely and transmit as easily, and it caused more severe disease than SARS-CoV-2. But it emerged from bats. And ever since that time, so over the last 10 years or so, there have been a lot of scientists who've been really interested in coronaviruses. And a lot of people have been looking in bats for SARS-like coronaviruses related to that first SARS virus. And people have found a lot of viruses in bats that were very similar to SARS. You can go back to literature in 2012, 2013, people were finding viruses in bats that looked a lot like SARS, and they looked like they were really close to breaching the species barrier to infect humans. And it's almost eerie now to read some of those papers where people were saying, this is coming, another one of these viruses will come, and we need to be prepared for it. We weren't as prepared as we should have been. And I hope when this is over that people at the federal level, people at the CDC, the World Health Organization, governments around the world, I hope they look back over the experience and they figure out what are the lessons that we can learn to prepare better for this. So there will be another one in the future. It may be a coronavirus, it may be an influenza virus, it may be something that catches us completely off guard, but there will be other pandemics. They happen with some regularity. They don't always affect our society and our economy the way this one has, but they'll happen. And I hope that we learn some lessons at the government level that will allow us to prepare for it better and prevent some of its impacts and recover from it more quickly. I'm not blaming the bats, Cole. I love the bats.
No, I'm just saying it's important to make a distinction in between the fact that it's not the bats directly giving us the disease, it's the circumstances in which transmission has occurred.
Yeah, that's an important point to make, right?
Because so it's already a semi-hated species. These
viruses have been in bats forever, right? And if they would just stay in bats, that'd be awesome. And one thing that we can do to help them stay in bats is stop intruding, right? Stop moving more and more aggressively and destructively as a human society into places where we're just asking for trouble, right? We're infringing on turf that for millennia has not been ours. And we're removing forests and jungles and to develop. And we need to be really careful about how we're doing that, because we are increasing the likelihood that we will be exposed to these things. The incidence of infectious disease, the incidence of pandemics will continue to rise as a result of climate change as well.
All right, well, thank you very much, Dr. Klein. This has been a very enlightening hour.
Thanks for inviting me. And this has been recorded, and I'm going to put in the chat, I'm going to put my email address. And if you had a question that you didn't get answered, or if you think of a question over the next couple of days,